It was in 1969 that the Air Force ended Project Blue Book, a 21-year investigation of UFOs. Their basic conclusion was that lack of evidence warranted no further study of the matter.
There was no evidence of threat to national security. There was no evidence that we had been visited by extraterrestrial vehicles. And finally, there was no evidence that after evaluating these UFO sightings that there was any indication of scientific knowledge, the existence of scientific knowledge beyond the present state of knowledge.
But government documents on the NORAD incidents, as well as thousands of other reports, reveal that the government continues to investigate a phenomenon that is much more than just a few isolated incidents. Since 1969, as many as 10 governmental agencies have been involved in UFO inquiries, including the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, and the Air Force. Attorney Peter Gersten has led the fight to unearth these documents on behalf of a group called Citizens Against UFO Secrecy.
The documents confirm the reality of these unconventional objects, and there is furthermore evidence that these objects exhibit a technology that is beyond present-day technology, an advanced technology, a more sophisticated technology.
A graphic example of that technology was reported in this document about an incident on September 19, 1976 in Iran. An F-4 jet similar to this one was sent to intercept unusual objects seen over the city of Tehran. As the F-4 approached the brilliant object, the jet lost all instrumentation and communication. Later, when the jet tried to shoot a missile at a second object, the F-4's weapon control panel went dead.
What makes this incident interesting and significant is that it involves the malfunction of an American-made defensive tactical weapon system, specifically an F-4 jet. The interesting part of the incident is that the Defense Intelligence Agency did an evaluation of the incident and found the incident to be a classic UFO case because of eyewitness verification, confirmed by radar, and so forth.
Documents show repeatedly that UFOs have been able to penetrate our military airspace. In one incident in 1980, UFOs were seen over Kirkland Air Force Base in New Mexico. The base is a highly sensitive installation that includes an advanced weapons research laboratory. Documents show that bright objects were able to land at the base undetected by radar. When security police tried to pursue the objects, they took off.
UFOs pose a threat to national security for many reasons, the first of which relate to the general principle that these objects have been unable to be identified by this government for the last 35 years. Another reason we see in the documents, which relate to the overflights over the military bases in 1975, the unrestricted and unlimited access that these objects had.
But Gersten and his group have been stopped in their pursuit of more information. The CIA refused to send Gersten 57 documents, and the Air Force has 100 documents that it refused to release. And recently, the National Security Agency did not release 160 documents for the same reason, national security. And in May of this year, the Supreme Court agreed with that agency.
The release of that information would be both embarrassing to the agency because it would show, once again, that the objects exist, that the objects are an advanced technology, and the objects do, in one way or another, pose a threat. So they don't want to release the information for that reason.
New York lawyer Peter Gersten sued the CIA and FBI to release 5,000 UFO-related documents.
The reading of all the documents reveals that UFOs have the ability to render inoperable present-day technology. UFOs have the ability to gain access to our most sensitive military installations, unrestricted and unlimited access to nuclear installations.
This New York State event occurred over a densely populated area and over a nuclear plant, prompting one eyewitness, New York attorney Peter Gersten, to suspect a government cover-up. With others like Larry Fawcett, a police officer in Coventry, Connecticut, he helped establish Citizens Against UFO Secrecy. Fawcett, who says the way he views the world has been drastically affected by his sightings of a UFO in 1965, petitioned the government for the release of UFO-related documents. These documents, released under the Freedom of Information Act, were previously classified top secret.
An example of some of the government documents we have obtained are the overflights over the military bases in 1975, over Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Michigan, over Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, Loring Air Force Base in Maine, Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. Over a period of 6 weeks, unusual, unknown, unidentified objects were traveling at exceedingly quick and fast speeds. What's interesting is that even to this date, the government has not acknowledged that it was able to identify any of those objects.
The documents do state that there were confirmed sightings at all 4 bases in October and November 1975. The first sighting was at Loring Air Force Base in Maine. Loring, like the other bases, was a Strategic Air Command installation. The documents do not state, however, that these objects were alien spacecraft. They do state that the military reaction was swift and concerned. At Loring, there were 2 separate events. Something unidentified appeared in the night sky above the weapons storage area. Larry Fawcett, having learned of the event and the released documents, investigated.
Military people and guards in and around the weapons storage areas began to report lights hovering or landing within the weapons storage areas. Military people would respond to the area only to see the lights go out and the object disappear and then reappear over the runway. It's described as football-shaped, the length of maybe 2 or 3 vehicles, cars, if you will. The witness telling us that there are shimmerings of heat, as you would see off a desert scene in a movie. When we questioned the individual, could it have been an aircraft? Could it have been a helicopter? The military person, and I'll give you his name, Steve Eichner, telling us, no, I know what helicopters look like. I've been around aircraft. I work on aircraft. This is something I've never seen before.
The official records, which I quote in my book, indicate that on the first night, it certainly was a helicopter. It was described as a helicopter. Now, if the officers on the base, experienced pilots, if they don't know a helicopter, and we have to depend on some GI who's not a pilot, who comes forward not at the time, but years later, he claims to have been there and claims it was not a helicopter. Again, let's go on the official records.
It is the official records that Fawcett uses to substantiate his claim that helicopters could not be the explanation. The military response at all 4 bases, he says, was too dramatic.
From our documentation, we know of pursuits that occurred, scrambling of aircraft from Loring Air Force Base, and the chases went up into the Canadian territory, if you will, only to be lost around New Brunswick somewhere up in that area.
There's no question there were overflights of unknowns, sometimes referred to as helicopters, but if you talk to the people, read the official government statements, it's clear that they were concerned, that there were scrambles of jets to go after these things, that they were being observed by highly qualified people. We were lied to, flat out, about those cases. As a matter of fact, some of the documents we eventually got clearly indicated that there were instructions to local base commanders. Don't say anything about the sightings at the other bases. Make it appear to be an isolated instance.
Military authorities will not comment on the 1975 overflights. They simply state that at any SAC installation, there would always be an immediate defensive response to anything unknown. Putting planes in the air, they say, does not confirm a penetration of an intergalactic craft. Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, however, refer to other documents they've gotten released by the Pentagon to prove their claims.
In May of 1985, we've gotten a document that was classified top secret in 1948, and about a month after its release to the other agencies, its distribution, it was ordered, recalled, and destroyed, each and every copy. 1 copy was kept, and it has remained top secret, classified top secret for the last, 40 years almost. And in the document, the government acknowledges back in 1948 the existence and reality of the objects.
The official military position about any document issued before the Project Blue Book investigation is that Blue Book later explained them. This includes a startling document written by a Canadian.
Wilbert Smith stated flat out in his top secret memo, and I think it was declassified by mistake, frankly, that this is the most classified subject in the United States, even more so than the H-bomb, and that flat out, flying saucers exist.
This is the opinion of one man, a Canadian officer, in 1947.
There are three basic reasons why the government does not come forward and release the information it has on UFOs. The first reason is technology. It is trying to learn as much about the objects before the Russians. The second reason is the vulnerability that could be shown by the revelations that might be forthcoming concerning UFOs. And the third reason is the hysteria that might be caused by the release of this information.
Gersten, who is a New York criminal attorney who filed a suit against the U.S. government to force them to release thousands of UFO-related documents. And rather than going through this entire introduction, I'll let Peter tell the story. What kinds of information were you looking for when you applied to the government through the FOI, and what agencies did you have to apply to?
Well, basically, we were looking for UFO-related information. There's no question about that. And we had to bring lawsuits, unfortunately, against the CIA, the National Security Agency, which is more secretive than the CIA. We had to bring lawsuits against the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Federal Aviation Administration for UFO-related documents.
What was the motivation for this, Peter? Are you a UFO person interested in
it was a hobby, but you have to remember that you can request documents of these agencies under the Freedom of Information Act. But unless they release the documents, you're forced to go into court to obtain the documents. And the CIA, for approximately the 30 years the agency was in existence and the UFO phenomena was in existence, and interesting enough, they both came into being more or less at the same time, refused to even acknowledge they were studying the phenomena.
Were you applying on your own behalf or on behalf of a client?
No, on behalf of Ground Saucer Watch, which is a UFO organization.
All right.
And the following suits were brought on behalf of Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, which is an organization I helped start with a couple of other people.
What did you find that you didn't know?
That we didn't know? Mm-hmm. Well, at least as far as I was concerned, you can speak to Alan and he will tell you he knew this all along. There's no question about the reality and the existence of these unconventional aerial objects. You have to remember that during the last 3 years, the government, and when I say the government, the agencies of this government, from the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the National Security Agency, NASA, all the agencies have released approximately 3,000 pages of documents that have been classified up until the present time. Documents that have been filed away in their drawers that nobody has ever seen other than military personnel. These documents have now come forward. Besides these documents, the CIA is withholding 57 UFO-related documents in their entirety. The National Security Agency is withholding 135 documents.
Do you have a clue to what's on those things they're withholding?
No, because the National Security Agency refuses to even tell us the number of documents they have. If it wasn't for the fact that we were in court and in the chambers of the federal judge, where the U.S. attorney admitted that it was 135 documents we were talking about.
But was Ground Saucer Watch looking for some specific kernel of information?
3 documents relating to a Ralph Mayer, who took a film of a UFO in 1952. And when they put in a request for any documents relating to Ralph Mayer, the CIA admitted that they had 5 documents, but refused to release 3 documents. A lawsuit was brought in September of 1977. There were negotiations, conferences with the U.S. attorney who represented the CIA. In September of 1978, the CIA and my client, through the attorneys, entered into a stipulation where the CIA agreed to conduct a reasonable search of all UFO-related documents. In December of 1978, the CIA released 900 pages of UFO-related documents, when in 1976 they told the director of Ground Saucer Watch that they had no interest in UFOs other than the Robertson Panel report.
So all of a sudden they just found 900 pages of...
Exactly, and the documents themselves indicated in the same year that they told Spaulding about the lack of interest, they were investigating certain UFO
Now,
incidents.
the word document carries a certain weight to it. When you say document, that could be a lease or title to a house. A document is something that's thought of being a heavy piece of paper. A document can also be a very simple piece of paper that contains really non-usable information. So you're using the word 900 documents.
900 pages of documents.
Right.
I don't know exactly. I
Well,
don't
what do these pages document?
Sightings, but what are referred to in the documents by responsible, reliable persons. You see, all along, before these documents were released, we've been reading civilian reports about individuals who've been seeing flying saucers or UFOs or flying discs, and their credibility. Now in the documents, these pages that were released by the FBI, the CIA, we see there was no question in the government's mind that these persons were reliable. They're referred to in the documents as early as 1949 as reliable, responsible military officials, generals, Air Force personnel, seeing these unconventional aerial objects. So there's no question. So now we see corroborated evidence that the people that do see these objects, that have been seeing them since 1949, are responsible people.
They're not
credible. If they testified in a court of law.
Well, you know, when I first interviewed Alan years ago, there was a theory going around that anybody who saw a flying saucer was probably befuddled by swamp gas somewhere in Louisiana and didn't know what he or she was seeing. We've had a lot of documentation since that time.
I think that one of the main things that has come out here that Peter has done is to substantiate the credibility of many of the civilians, because it was easy to, and still is, to discredit a civilian. Much more difficult to discredit a military man. In Blue Book, for instance, we would get reports from military pilots, and that was particularly embarrassing to the Air Force, because after they had trained those men, and they couldn't very well, they could say that a civilian pilot might have been untrustworthy, but they could hardly say that to of their own military pilots, and we got case after case after case from military pilots which never hit the press.
Remember about 10 years ago, maybe even longer, there were reports of sightings in the daily press on an almost weekly basis. There'd be an account on page 3 or 4 of most major newspapers that somebody somewhere in this country had sighted a flying saucer. Oftentimes there'd be a photograph of the sky with an object or something. You don't see much of that in newspapers anymore. Are there no sightings, or is the press not reporting them? Do they consider it not to be newsworthy?
That's it. To a large extent, it's no longer news, because the same sorts of things are being reported. You see, if it was something new, this is the one. There are 3 things about this whole thing, Tom, that no one can deny. They're incontrovertible points. Even the grossest skeptic can't deny them. First of all, is that the UFO reports not only exist but persist. See, when I started with the Air Force, I thought that this was a fad. In a few years, it would just disappear.
Be all over, okay.
And it's global. We have reports now from 140 countries. I mean, practically as many countries as there are in the United Nations. And the most important of the 3 things is that many, unfortunately not all, but many of the reports come from highly, highly credible, technically trained people, you see.
What do the Russians say about flying saucers? Do they have anything like this going on?
Alan is the expert in that area.
Here we have a report issued under the sponsorship of the...
Let me do the commercial, and then the Russians. We're talking about whether the Russians have a policy on UFOs or flying saucers, as we call them.
Well, until very recently, everything you read in Pravda said that flying saucers were propaganda from the decadent Western societies. But recently, the Russian Academy of Sciences has released a report called The Observations of Anomalous Atmospheric Phenomena in the USSR. It doesn't sound like it's UFO, but they say in the introduction, we use the term anomalous atmospheric phenomenon because we consider the previously used term UFO to be less adequate for such work, since it contains a definite interpretation of the phenomenon. You see, there's the point. In the public mind, UFO is synonymous with little green men from outer space. That's putting the cart before the horse. What we are studying at the Center for UFO Studies in Evanston are the properties of a phenomenon. Here there's this constant flow of reports whose contents are bizarre and tremendously intriguing. That's what we're studying. And the center is basically a collection of a rather loose association of scientists from various universities who have become intrigued by this intellectually challenging thing.
In your going through the documentation, were there any stories that you found in there where you could say, this is it? Here all the criteria have been met. Here the government is admitting, yes, somebody saw something and we must admit that it happened.
See, the problem is that if you pick out one report, there's always going to be somebody to take that report apart. There are approximately, over the last 10 years, since the beginning of 1973, at Hunter Airfield in Georgia, there was a sighting, an Army document. In 1975, in Algeria, in March of 75, there was an unusual sighting that the documents reflect. Documents are from all over the world. In 1975, over 5 SAC military bases,
particularly good ones.
There was a mini evasion of unidentified objects that called for the Air Force to implement Security Option 3 because one of the UFOs over Loring Air Force Base demonstrated a clear intent in the weapons storage area. See, that's a problem. The government on the one hand says that no UFO studied or investigated has ever been a threat to national security, and here we have in 1975 UFOs more or less invading In 1976, there was an incident September 19th, 1976 over Iran, which the Defense Intelligence Agency, which got the report from the attaché's office in Iran, evaluated as an outstanding report, a classic report, because it contained all the characteristics necessary to evaluate a UFO report. An F-4 came in contact with a UFO, multicolored, brilliant light, and on approaching, an F-4 is an American-made Iranian jet, on approaching, and we have to realize that this is an American-made jet we're talking about in 1976, on approaching the UFO, which was spotted on both radar and visually, it lost all instrumentation and communication systems. They went out. And then when it decided to leave the area, the instrumentation and communication systems came back on. Another F-4 jet was launched, and as it approached the UFO, out of this UFO came another UFO, an unidentified object, 1/3 the size, with intense brilliance, and came straight at the F-4. The F-4 tried to fire an AIM-4 missile at this UFO.
Not a smart move, you know,
and
it's
lost
not very bright.
once again, all instrumentation, communication, and now its weapons control panel went out.
You know what I think part of the problem with the whole perception business of UFOs is, number one, you said it, we're putting the cart before the horse, but rather than identifying what the objects are, we're trying to guess what's inside the objects. The other one is movies. Media. The first movie I ever saw that I can remember that related to this was one called The Day the Earth Stood Still. A good picture, but it was an alien force that caused some harm.
Yeah.
All the motors and the power stopped. Yeah. And I think we have been so programmed by fantasy motion pictures, television presentations, and in some cases science fiction writing, to think that whatever they are against us.
Fantastic interest throughout the UK in the recent trials and tribulations, shall we say, regarding your efforts to challenge various government departments as to the dissemination, if you will, of documented information relating to triangular craft. You're the man on the spot, shall we say. How would you appraise the current situation? I mean, this is quite a unique thing, isn't it, to get the judge to actually side with you?
Oh, yes. This is the first time Cause has brought Citizens Against UFO Secrecy. In the last 20 years has brought maybe 6 lawsuits. This is the first time the judge has been receptive to my arguments, receptive to the point of directing a governmental agency to provide a UFO group with additional information.
Now, what is it about the triangles that you feel is so significant, or is this just a part of the whole big picture here?
Well, you're right on both accounts. Number one, it's part of the big picture, but it also involves an object the size of a football field that can hover, or what's described as, from witnesses, as floating, which is unusual to describe a mechanical craft, that can accelerate rapidly, attain high speeds, that's virtually noiseless, that has orbs around the sides that detach and attach. I think that since this object is being seen in populated areas over the last 20 years, not only in this country, but in England and in Belgium and other countries, I think it's time we found out about it. And what's more significant is that when we inquired of this object from the Department of Defense, they told us they conducted a reasonable search and can find no information on this object. As far as I'm concerned, they're lying to us. It can't be possible because they searched the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and they had no information. They searched the Joint Chiefs of Staff and they had no information. And the Department of Defense is charged with gathering intelligence and providing security for the citizens of this country. So how can they not know about an object that's seen at treetop level in populated areas over major cities in this age of terrorism? Well, the Department of Defense, for whatever reason, has not come to the courtroom, has not sent any attorneys. They are represented by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And they just toe the party line. They treat this as any other Freedom of Information request. The agency does the search. If they don't find documents, they move to dismiss it on the grounds a reasonable search was done. If they find documents, they either release them or withhold them on national security grounds. And that's what I thought this case would be about. The Department of Defense would find documents and say national security, as they did in the other cases Cause brought, and that would be the end of it. No judge has gone against that ruling. But they didn't. They stated they found no documents. They did a reasonable search. So the U.S. Attorney is just putting forward that position that they didn't have to do an exhaustive search
All they had to do is a reasonable search. They did a reasonable search. There are no documents. What we submitted, what Citizens Against UFO Secrecy submitted, were 33 affidavits from people that actually saw the object, were willing to come forward, put it down on paper, and then swear to the contents. So we submitted this to the judge, said, Judge, look, this object exists, Judge. It exists not only over the last 20 years, but it was seen last month. You know, so how can they not have information? How can they have done a reasonable search and not found anything? And the judge was convinced that at least at this level they have to provide us with more information telling us about their search.
The obvious question then arises, where are we going with this now? Where does Peter Gersten and Citizens Against UFO Secrecy hope to take this now? What's the next step?
We hope to go where no group has gone before. We hope to go into the darkest recesses of these governmental agencies to search for the truth and to end the secrecy.